Episode 19, Can a Christian be an Anarchist? With Mance Rayder.
The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
I'm rising up with a full heart. I'm taking my strength from inside. I'm rising up with a new mind. I'm taking your words and letting it all behind. I'm coming up from underneath the wreck.
Hi everyone, welcome back. Today's episode is an interview I did with Mance Rayder for his podcast, The Free Man Beyond the Wall. We get into a lot of biblical and philosophical defenses of Christianity and anarchism. But before we begin, and if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button on whatever podcatcher you're using so not to miss any future episodes. And if you're not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, and YouTube. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider letting us know by leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes or wherever you catch this episode. It'll help us reach more listeners and grow the show. Also, you can support the show with a one-time or monthly donation through Patreon. Thank you, Thomas, for becoming our newest patron. If anyone else is interested, visit the support tab on anarchochristian.com. That will take you to our Patreon page where you'll find a few ways that you can support us. So if you like what we're doing, hit the link and check out the options for support. And thank you again, Thomas, for your financial support. All right, on with the episode. As I mentioned, we get into a lot of biblical and philosophical defenses for Christian anarchism. We also touch on some interpretations of events in the Bible and Scripture that we find prevalent in the church, but also dangerous. So without further delay, here's my appearance on Mance Rayder's Free Man Beyond the Wall.
Hey everybody, I want to welcome you to the Free Man Beyond the Wall podcast. This is your host, Mance Rayder. Well, I have a special show today, something way out of the ordinary. I asked Stephen, who you will find on social media as Anarcho-Christian. He's Anarcho-Christian on Facebook and Anarcho-Christian on Twitter. I asked him to come on and talk about why anarchism is the only consistent position for a Christian to have. I knew this was going to be controversial. One of the reasons I asked him to come on is because I saw someone post on Facebook that there is no way that a Christian can be an anarchist. And from my reading of the Bible, I totally disagreed. So I asked Stephen to come on because he makes memes about how Christians should not be worshiping the state and how they should only be, their only king should be God. And I thought this would be something really interesting and something really out of the ordinary for my podcast. So this is a great discussion. I really hope you enjoy it, and I hope you learn a lot from it. That's really important to me, that people who don't know anything about Christianity, or especially people who may consider themselves to be Christians but don't understand why anarchists would be the only consistent position, would listen to this, ask questions, and I think I say in the body of this podcast that I think this is probably going to generate more comments than any other podcast I've ever done. So without any further delay, here is Steve, the Anarcho-Christian. All right, everybody, I'm here with Stephen. He is the Anarcho-Christian on Twitter and on Facebook. How are you doing, Stephen?
I'm doing great, Mance. Thanks for having me.
No problem, man. I saw something on Facebook the other day that made me want to, I wanted to have you on to talk about it. Someone had posted in a private group. They said that there is no way that a Christian can be an anarchist.
Yeah.
And as somebody who, before we started this, I told you that I'm a lapsed Christian, and if if I do have any faith, it is literally the size of a mustard seed right now. But how would you? I mean, we're going to get into some deep stuff here. But how would you start to respond to that?
Yeah, that's definitely something that I see quite a bit. Doing the anarcho-Christian social media, the podcast and stuff, and that is a very common objection. Is just no, it can't be, and what I usually say to that is when someone does want to talk about, I guess just really general how that could be. I like to bring everything down to, the initiation of force. And where anarchism is concerned, it's principally the rejection of the initiation of force against somebody else. And Christianity, though it may not appear that way today, in the groups that most people are exposed to, Christianity is the same way. It's the rejection of the initiation of force. Getting into a lot of your libertarian verbiage and phrases, the non-aggression principle, I guess depending on where this person's coming from as an objection, if they're a libertarian and they say, or an anarchist, and they say, well, Christianity isn't compatible with this. I try to appeal to some of those core principles. And I think the non-aggression principle is a great one. Because we see so many times in the New Testament, especially where we as Christians are told by Christ and the apostles to do things that are very similar to what you see in the non-aggression principle.
There's so many places we could start, especially since it's been since I told you that I'm very, very familiar with the Bible, and as soon as I became an anarchist, I looked back on all my on the Bible, and I'm like, oh yeah, being an anarchist is really the only way that a Christian you should live their life, if you read, if you understand your reading of the Bible. So, okay, let's go to the main objections. Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2.
Yeah. So actually just, the last episode that I put out was on, Romans 13. And, I read,
let's talk about, what does Romans 13 say?
So Romans 13, and I don't have it out here in front of me, but it's so the Romans 13. When someone says Romans 13, they're generally referring to the first 7 verses of Romans 13, and it starts out with saying, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." And that really, I think, kind of sums up the objection of Romans 13 is just there in the first verse. And what I went through with the last episode was visiting a few pages from David Lipscomb's book, Civil Government, and kind of went through what he had to say as far as an interpretation of Romans 13. And this is from a very pacifist, anti-state. I believe he was a pastor from the late 1800s. And, when he gets into Romans 13, and this is something that most anyone who's anti-state or an anarchist, when discussing Romans 13, we're going to need to back up into Romans 12. And Romans 12, and let me take another sidestep, that Romans, the book of Romans, what we have is the book of Romans, and the way that it's written out today with the chapter breakdowns and the verse breakdowns, that is not the way that it was originally written. It's the way that the Bible has come together over the years. And it's very handy for finding, a spot really quickly in a book. A lot of books of antiquity are written like that, where you can jump straight to this giant, encyclopedia work, from someone in antiquity. And it's usually broken down into books and verses and passages. So anyways, what we like to do though is to look at Romans as a whole. And of course we are talking about, at least 13 chapters here, right? So, we can't just dive into the whole 12 chapters prior to it. But if we back up a little bit to Romans 12, we see, Paul writing that a Christian, some of these, characteristics of a Christian, are to love one another and to bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them, rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep, live in harmony. We see these sorts of not necessarily commands, but these kind of instructions to the church in Rome. And once he gets into the section that we've then, capped off as Romans 13, he says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. And one thing that I think is very important is that we do expand our Romans 13 into Romans 12, and we see what he's laying out as instructions for the way that a Christian should live. And we see, once we get to the portion that's labeled as Romans 13, once we get into that, we see something different, something contradictory to the actions of a Christian. These are the actions of this governing authority that will use force against other people. And what we saw from David Lipscomb's reading is that he likens the state to a tool of God, that God can use the state. Now, the state, because it's being used by God, doesn't mean that it's something that we should worship. It's not something that we should pledge allegiance to. It's not even something that we should really even be a part of. This is showing that the life and the actions of a Christian are different than those of this state entity.
Well, relate that to 1 Samuel chapter 8.
Sure. And in 1 Samuel chapter 8, we see, and to give a little bit of historical context, the nation of Israel was not led by a king at that time. And it was led by a prophet, the prophet Samuel. And it had a system of judges. And so in 1 Samuel 8, we see the people of Israel coming to Samuel and saying, we want to be just like all of these other countries. We want to be like all these other nations, and we want a king. We want a king to go out before us. We want a king to represent us and to defend us. And the language that they use, these are attributes of God that they want now for a man to do. And Samuel is, of course, completely grieved by this, goes to God, and God says, don't worry about it. They haven't rejected you. They've rejected me. And that goes into that language of we want this man to represent us the way that you represent us. And so God gives Samuel a list of things to tell the people of Israel, that if you do accept this king, if you want a king, then these are the things that are going to happen. And he lays out very clearly that there will be taxation, that there will be forced labor, that there will be slavery, enslavement, conscription into the king's military. We see a lot of things that when we read it, they're not just attributes to a king at that moment. Their attributes to any king in any government. That this is the result of having a king. This is the necessary. This is what will happen if you have a king. And again, using the words that God said, this is a rejection of God.
Now, no disrespect to the scripture, and I'm not questioning it there, but I want to draw a parallel. And that parallel of 1 Samuel chapter 8 is when, certain people, libertarian atheists, where we talk about how, we should live by the non-aggression principle. We should live by our own conscience. And by people saying no because, people can't be trusted and everything, they're basically, it's the same thing. They're asking for a king to rule over them. And when they ask for a king to rule over them, they get a government such as we have. And all of those things come along with it. Conscription, taxation, a police force, people don't see that. And I think it really troubles me that Christians don't see it.
Absolutely.
Do you think it's just a lack of, I know this from being in church. Maybe 5% of us actually even read the Bible on a regular basis, studied. My dad was a ordained minister, and I saw it clearly. I saw 1 Samuel chapter 8 as, okay, you're rejecting God's authority and you want a man to rule over you. Now look at the horrors that you're going to get because you're allowing, because you want a man to rule over you. And then, you relate it to something like, and people will start talking about Romans chapter 13 or 1 Peter 2 and not realizing that, if you were to take Romans 13 as, where you're supposed to worship the state or something like, or you're supposed to put the state on the same level as God, then anything the state does, you have to back. And, we see in this country right now, there is no one more patriotic and no one more pro-military and no one who wants to, because of dispensationalism, back wars in the Middle East, no matter what.
Yes.
It just doesn't, is it because of just not reading the book?
Right. I think that is a large portion of it. I think that we have a large portion of just, not reading it. And when you combine that with all the stuff that I'm sure you'll say, yes, this has happened in the United States, this growth of patriotism. That's when you combine that, when you have someone who doesn't understand the way that the state reacts to people, the way that we're supposed to react, and how that's different, and when you no longer have that as a basis of the way that a Christian should behave, you start obviously misinterpreting verses that are intended to tell a Christian not to violently revolt, not to take vengeance for yourself, and start rolling those things into this nationalistic belief. And that's really, I think, where we've gone. I think that in the beginning, the beginning of the 20th century was a big moment where we see events not just in the country, but in parallel, we see new interpretations of the Bible popping up. And you mentioned dispensationalism. So it's right there around the beginning of the 20th century where we start having this new teaching of dispensationalism. And it's honestly a new way, at that time, a new way of interpreting the Bible. And it's a very large interpretation that is today the general overall assumption of the Bible. It's what everyone teaches and what everyone thinks.
Probably 90% to 95% of the churches teach a dispensational eschatology. And when I say eschatology, I know you know what I mean, but it's basically end times teaching, what the Bible teaches about Christ coming back and judging the world, or if you're a preterist, you don't believe that. You believe that may have happened in AD 70 over, with Rome's destruction of Jerusalem, and that's for a whole different another podcast.
It's a great topic.
Oh, it really? I mean, I could talk about that I have talked about that for hours, and sat and just talked for hours about AD 70 and the timing of certain books, when certain books were written, possibly. But getting back on the subject of now. When I see somebody posting somebody posting just a random post on Facebook saying that there's no possible way that a Christian can be an anarchist, that, to me, that person is looking at the way Christians act, the way their patriotism, their volunteering for the army, saying stuff on social media like, I would be proud if my children died for my country, died for our country one day, because our country's a Christian country.
Yeah, and that is what they're now defining as Christianity, is the civil religion that's kind of grown up over these few generations, in the 20th century especially. That is their definition now of Christianity. And like you said, that's like 90% of Christians think that way too. So I don't fault people when that is their initial reaction, because they haven't read the Bible either, I'm sure. At least in a way that maybe is new now in 2018, to them, understanding that there are these different interpretations, and of course, when you're dealing with interpretations, you need to really look at the whole picture, the big picture. And when you do that will take you away from the current understanding of Christianity and this nationalistic, dispensational view of the Bible. It really will take you away from that. And we can have a conversation about the spiritual side of things, but I think that the Bible speaks for itself when it comes to these commandments and things like that. That even if you're an atheist, you should be able to say, yes, anarchism is the only compatible, political philosophy with Christianity.
Now, I've mentioned dispensationalism, and you've mentioned it too. Can you give like the 2-minute version of, and what I'm talking about really the end times theology, and how it shapes 90 to 95% of modern Christianity's politics? Yeah.
So the short end of it is basically, anything that you've kind of witnessed of American conservatism, that's dispensationalism. And what it really does boil down to theologically is Israel. It's the interpretation of the word Israel. And so what you see today in the dispensational belief is that Israel, the current ethnic nation state of Israel, is, God's chosen people. So then we have a position where the United States takes a very vocal, very public defense of the nation state of Israel that exists right now. And you think, well, everything, as long as we're, backing the nation state of Israel, then everything that we're doing is right. Everything that we're doing is good. And then that's when you start getting a lot of that, that willingness to die for your country, that's doing everything right, that's doing everything godly and God ordained. And then when you're presented with examples of cronyism and examples of manipulation of the public and this endless war, you have to make a decision. And most times, unfortunately, people kind of double down on the patriotism and double down on the state because they've built that faith into it. They've built that Christian Bible backing into it. And it's something that, even myself, I wasn't always a libertarian. I was a neocon, for lack of better words. I was supportive of everything. I played into the left-right political, arguments. And, as long as he's a Republican, he's going to be better than the other side, but when you're presented with those challenging things, either scripturally or in politics and in foreign policy, when you start to really examine those things, you can go one of two ways. You can double down on your faith in the state and the civil religion that they've built with this Christian veneer, or you can just reject it for the truth of Scripture.
Well, one thing I'll add to that is that one of the main facets of dispensationalism is that the ethnic Jews that are in Israel had to go back to the homeland, which we saw in 1947, 1948. And the other big part of it is they have to rebuild the temple, and they have to start sacrificing again, like in the Old Testament.
Right.
And part of that teaching, and now a lot of this comes from what you would call apocalyptic literature in the Bible, Daniel, Ezekiel, obviously the book of Revelation. And apocalyptic literature is, from my understanding of history, well, at least history, Christianity before 150 years ago was mostly read as symbolic. And then about 100 years ago, people started reading it with the newspaper next to them. Sure. And they started comparing it to, they believed that if they saw, something, they could see something in the newspaper that they could point and say, "Ooh, this is in the Bible too." So we have this, and we had a whole bunch of people. Like, there was one guy who had written a book how the rapture was going to happen in 1988, and then was that Hal Lindsey?
Hal Lindsey, yeah.
They had made all these predictions, and the worst thing about it was whenever the predictions didn't come true. John Hagee's another one famous for all this. When the predictions didn't come true, Christians didn't call them on it. They just changed their tune and said, "Oh, I got my calculations wrong."
Yeah, absolutely.
And so going back to the rebuilding of this temple, well, obviously, if this is going to happen, then anything Israel needs to do in order to make it happen, even genocide, even violence, is okay. Right. Because until this happens, Jesus is not going to come back.
Right.
So basically, dispensationalism, and Scott Horton makes a point about all the Israeli lobby groups in the United States, and he says you don't even need all of those. The biggest Israeli lobby group in the United States is evangelical Christians.
Yeah, he's absolutely right.
Yeah, so that's why they're pro-war. That's why anything that will be. They'll back anything that's happening in the Middle East as long as Israel's not getting hurt. They need to be protected at all costs. Yeah. And I also want to relate it this way. Okay. I know there's a bunch of libertarians, there's a bunch of anarchists, and a bunch of voluntarists listening to this. And we are 2% of the population? Mm-hmm. It's usually, that's the way it works. There's always this, for lack of a better term, elect, chosen, that actually go forth with the, who understand the truth of what's going on at any given time. And they're looked upon as lunatics. You want liberty, we want liberty too much. Your liberty is dangerous. And you can relate that to Christianity now is, it's a very small sliver of Christians that are actually carrying on with the message that was, taught for 1800 years when it wasn't being perverted by the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I agree that this kind of interpretation of Israel, you're spot on. Your quote from Scott Horton is spot on. And that is a relatively recent, new interpretation. And I think that now it's just the assumed understanding that everyone has. It reaches into all manner of denominations. And, so I might take a second to say, what is the right one then? And, because the scripture is there, it says something. And, I'm saying that they're misinterpreting it. Well, Israel in the Bible is the faithful. It's the believers, the ones that have faith in God. And it's not an ethnicity. And that's really what it boils down to. Is this, it's not replacement theology, because that in and of itself has shown to kind of build this anti-Semitic view of things.
When you say replacement theology, explain that.
Okay, so the idea is in replacement theology is that God loved the Jews, the ethnic Jews, and when Christ came, the Jews killed Christ, and so now he's done with all the Jews, and so he's given it to the Gentiles, and they have it, and God hates the Jews. Essentially, it's not going to be said like that, but that is what comes out of the replacement theology kind of ideology. You'll see a lot of that, and that unfortunately is the accusation then towards someone who holds a different view of that, but is not holding the dispensational view of Israel. And as I said, the correct view would be that Israel is a faith. It's people that have faith in God. Those are God's people. And that is made up of ethnic Jews, and it's made up of, of anyone else, anyone all over the world. No skin color, male, female, nobody's more important than the other. It's faith in God.
All right. Talk about basically committing violence for the state. Now, yeah. I know a lot of people will point to the verse in Luke that I can't get I'm sure I could pull it up in 5 seconds, but it's the one about sell your cloak and buy a sword.
Yeah.
Or there will come a time. And what's funny is everybody takes that as he's telling, like he's communicating to his followers aggression.
Yeah.
And not defense. Yeah,
absolutely. That is the problem with, looking at these single verses that, sometimes they're not even a full sentence. You'll have one sentence that takes up 2 verses. And when it comes to using force, as I said at the beginning, that, where Christianity and anarchism, really, becomes clear that they're compatible is in this rejection of the initiation of force. And every other, government is force. I think it was Harry Brown that said that, government is force. And, anarchism is not doing something to somebody else. And all of your other, political philosophies is, what can we do? How much can we do to someone else? Or how much will I allow done to me? And I think it's great. And that this is the optimal, form of government, So anarchism is just, it's that rejection from yourself, that you're not going to rule over someone else. I am not going to initiate force against you. And, when it comes to verses like, that are taken way out of context like that, like in Luke about buying the swords, that's the problem, is looking at just that one verse about buying a sword. And you've got to look at the whole of that passage, at the whole of that book. And when you look at that verse in Luke, we see Jesus. This is after the Lord's Supper, that you see, depicted a lot in paintings. And, so it's prior to him going to the cross that night. And he specifically says in the next verse that go get a sword so that we will be numbered among the transgressors. He doesn't say go get a sword so that you can fight somebody. And what we see, shortly after they leave the room and he goes to pray in the garden, and then the I think it was the Pharisees show up with armed guards to grab him, and I think it's Peter, if I'm not mistaken, uses that sword to then slice off the ear of one of the guards. So this is the same sword that he said to make sure that you have, so that we can be numbered among the transgressors. So as soon as Peter uses this sword, and if that verse about getting the sword was, hoorah, let's go out and kill people, why would Jesus say, no, put away this sword and then heal the man that was attacked? So it's very dangerous to just create an entire foreign policy and everything, this whole narrative off of just one verse, and you just see Jesus say, go buy a sword.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of that. Denominations have been built around that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The last time I checked, and this is years ago, I had looked up and it had said that it was at that time there was 45,000 different denominations in the United States that have been registered.
Wow. I was not even aware of that. Wow.
Yeah. Oh, and it has to be more now because, we're talking years ago. Uh-huh. But, there was in Fort Lauderdale where I lived, there was a Country and Western Church. And that was what it was called. It was the Country and Western Church. And I believe they were their own denomination. So yeah, taking verses out of context. But, when it comes down to it, the non-aggression principle is just it's the golden rule, which is what Jesus said.
Yeah.
It's do unto others.
Yeah, absolutely. I like to call it the silver rule because it's, saying don't do to someone else, and Jesus had the golden rule of doing unto others, it's kind of positive, negative action, but yeah, it absolutely lines up there.
And you can see the cherry picking of verses. Jesus basically he kept the law as a Jew. Mm-hmm. But, and then, and then people were like, well, after, if Jesus is the fulfillment of the law, we don't have to follow the law anymore. And even in the Bible, you have arguments over this. Paul has to come back to Jerusalem to talk, to answer to the apostles. Mm-hmm. And, it's people, I don't think people realize how much of Christianity was like, how much of this stuff was fleshed out at an early time, mm-hmm. and how much especially once once Constantine made it the official religion of the Roman Empire. I think it was in 312. Just mm-hmm. how everything got perverted, and then it got related to the state, and people started seeing it that people started relating it to the state, and then obviously the Catholic Church growing out of that. So, it's not as simple. People who don't understand the history of it don't understand that at one time, for a couple centuries, Christians were persecuted, and you'd just be killed for being a Christian. And
Right.
They were the most peaceful people out there. They wouldn't even, at that point, they weren't even fighting back.
Well, and that's when Romans 13 was written during the worst persecution of Christians under Nero. And, absolutely. I think it's a big shocker to people when they find out that our current understanding of Christianity and the way that it relates with the state is very new, because we have, Christians during this time, under Nero that are, like you said, they're being persecuted. They're being, murdered and ripped limb from limb in the Colosseum for sport. Everyone hates them, simply not because they're out, fighting back against Rome, but they just won't acknowledge Rome. And that really is where Christian anarchists are supposed to find themselves. We're not to be violently overthrowing, the current state, but we're not to worship it. But of course, people say, well, I'm not worshiping it, but with the cherry picking of verses that we've already talked about, it also, what comes with that is the complete ignoring of other verses. And I think a big one with our current state-focused church is the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus tells us to love our enemies, to do good to those who hate us, not to repay evil for evil. And we see that echoed all throughout the epistles as well, to, pray for those who mistreat us, and on and on. These things that, even if you're not a Christian, you know that this is what the Bible says that Christians should look like, and it just does not look like that today, but it looked like it then, but not today.
Yeah, I mean, really, for a Christian to be gung ho about the state, to be, to call it a Christian country, to want to join the military, to fight against enemies, you really have to cherry pick, because that's not I don't think people realize this, especially in the New Testament. That is not, the message is not one of being a joiner. Mm-hmm. It's being introspective. It's being peaceful, really. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's, the time I spent in church, the time I spent learning, I spent a lot of time just in quiet meditation, it sounds almost monastic, but it really wasn't. It really wasn't. And that is so at odds with what I think the majority of Christians believe Christianity is. And obviously people who are outside of it are, people who are outside of the church look and they just assume that's what Christianity is. So, I mean, what do you think you have to do in order to, help people outside to understand, our fellow anarchists, to understand exactly where you're coming from?
Yeah, that is definitely the case. And one thing that I like to point to is, even if we're not going to have a discussion on, I'm going to try to convince you of the deity of Jesus. I do think that everyone can come to the conclusion that, the current, state of the church and its relationship to the state, that's not biblical. And, even if as an atheist, libertarian, I think that even if you don't, like I said, agree with the divinity of Christ and the existence of God, maybe we can come to an understanding of the Christian anarchist position when we look at government, that the state ruling over someone else, that is a relationship, what I like to call the horizontal relationship. It's man to man. We're on the same plane. And that is where, as a Christian anarchist, I reject, primarily because of Scripture, that I reject that we should be doing that. That's not my place to rule over another man, and that's that horizontal relationship. And then the relationship between a Christian and God, well, that's a vertical relationship, and it's not. That's why anarchism doesn't really venture into the spiritual conversation. It's that relationship between a man and a man. And I know that there's a lot of people out there that, when they describe their anarchism, they will say that, it's no God, no masters. And I understand that. But again, I think that is a misunderstanding of what anarchism is. And anarchism is that horizontal relationship between man and man.
Yeah. I mean, I always took the commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. Mm-hmm. So many people will say, well, there were so many pagan religions at the time and everything. So he's delineating. And I'm like, no, I always took that as that anything can be a god. I mean, any distraction in your life, anything can become a god. Don't be attached to anything but me. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's the way I always took it. And that's pretty much the way I was taught, being more around, Reformed and, Calvinistic people. Yeah,
you're absolutely right. And everything can be a god. Anything can be, an idol. And, that's one thing that's hard to, I guess, when the conversation is between a Christian and a Christian, and, letting them know that, that state can be an idol, that's what you're doing. It's a tough conversation. To me, it's sometimes it's harder than having that conversation with a non-theist, because so much of their family and their emotions and their understanding of the Bible is wrapped up into that, what we've already talked about, what we've already described as a misunderstanding, misinterpretation of the Scriptures.
Yeah. Well, we're going to wrap it up. So talk about your podcast and where people can find you.
All right. I appreciate it. So anarchochristian.com, that's kind of the home hub there. We have blogs and a podcast that you can find on iTunes or Stitcher, Google Play, anywhere where you find your podcast. You should be able to subscribe to it there. And then also the social media pages, Facebook and Twitter. And, I'd be happy if anybody has any questions, anything that we talked about, today, hit me up either in public on the social media platforms or even in private. I think it's every day. I hear from either a Christian or a non-Christian wanting to know more information, about what we're doing.
I've had some really, I have Scott Horton on all the time. I've had Ron Paul on. I've had Tom Woods on. I've had a lot of people on here, but for some reason, I think I'm going to get more comments about this one than anything else.
Well, definitely, those guys, I love everybody that you just named, from Ron Paul, Scott Horton, and Tom Woods. And, your comments may be, because, why are you having this guy on here or something? It may not be as good as, the comments, having those guys.
No, but here's the thing, man. Here's why I wanted to have you on. I don't want this to be the normal libertarian podcast. I want this to be where I invite people on that I may not I mean, I had a guy on who said, he's anti-war. And we talked about that, how the left isn't anti-war anymore, but he described himself as to being left of Bernie Sanders. And I wanted to have him on just, to talk, because he was a Vietnam War against the Vietnam War, and everything. So I don't want this to be the typical, let's have everybody who let it be an echo chamber.
Yeah.
I want this to be interesting. And, one thing when I first started noticing your posts, it really spoke to me because I always felt, when I had a whole heck of a lot more faith than I do right now, that, I had no room for the government in my life.
Mm-hmm.
It's very hard for me, and my dad, I've talked about this before, that my dad, was an ordained Southern Baptist minister. He was ordained later in life when he was in his early 40s, but, he was a minister for almost 30 years before he died. And he was one of those guys who, he used to tell me all the time, he said, I wish they would change the laws so that I could preach right-wing politics from the pulpit.
Yes.
So, I had to hear that, and it just never made any sense to me that, from a political standpoint or from a spiritual standpoint, that that's something that you would want to do.
I hear you. And that's something that I hope I'm achieving with anarcho-Christian. When I discovered Christian anarchism and the writings of Tolstoy and David Lipscomb and all these other great writers that vary greatly on different theological positions, but when I found this kind of unifying idea of rejecting violence, rejecting the state's violence specifically, it was refreshing for me. And I hope that, that's my goal, is that, I can bring that refreshing, understanding out there, because I think people that are Christians and non-theists, that I think everybody kind of has that same, reaction, where it's like, this is a refreshing, consistent message.
Well, man, I appreciate you coming on, and maybe down the line we'll do it again.
I hope so. Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, take care, man. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for tuning in to the Free Man Beyond the Wall podcast. I want to thank Stephen for coming on. I want to remind you that I wrote 2 books, Freedom Through Memedom and The Kids Are Not All Right. Check them out on Amazon or on my website, freemanbeyondthewall.com/store, where you can buy them for crypto. That's it. See you next week with another podcast. Take care, and bye.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that. I'd like to thank Mance for having me on his show. Let me know what your thoughts were on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube. Don't forget to rate or review the show on iTunes, and please think about supporting us through Patreon. If you're interested in grabbing copies of the books that were mentioned, I will have an Amazon link in the show notes. If you use this link, Anarcho-Christian will receive a small commission with no additional charge to you. And while you're there on Amazon, check out some of our t-shirts and hoodies. So until next time, grace and peace, no king but Christ.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com, like us on facebook.com/anarchochristian, and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.